escape. Most disturbing were the specially designed restraints, crafted from supple leather that would not leave the telltale marks of iron shackles, yet proved impossible for small hands to unfasten. Local physician Dr. Thaddeus Warrington, called to examine the rescued children, recorded his findings in trembling script. His medical journal, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, describes the methodical malnutrition, sufficient to weaken resistance but not induce death, and the curious absence of sunlight exposure that had rendered the children's skin unnaturally pallid, as if carved from tallow rather than living flesh. The Caldwells' standing in society initially insulated them from the full force of public outrage. Prominent families who had dined at their table expressed disbelief, suggesting that perhaps the children had been secretly harbored for humanitarian purposes, a narrative the Caldwells themselves attempted to promote. This protective shield began to crumble when several Missouri matrons recognized certain distinctive garments worn by the youngest children as belonging to families who had reported their offspring missing over the preceding years. As summer's heat descended upon the investigation, the smokehouse revealed its final horrors. Beneath the earthen floor of the deepest cell, investigators discovered small remains, bones showing evidence of systematic starvation, and in some cases, methodical dissection performed with surgical precision. The most damning evidence against the Caldwells came from Abigail Thornton, a kitchen servant whose testimony would later be recorded in the county records as the breaking of the dam. A woman of 36 years with work-hardened hands and eyes that had witnessed too much, Abigail had maintained her silence through fear rather than complicity. "I knew something weren't right," she told investigators, her fingers nervously working the frayed edges of her apron. "The missus would have me prepare these special broths, strengthening broths, she called them, but never let me deliver them myself. Always took them from my hands at the kitchen door." Abigail's testimony revealed Eleanor Caldwell's meticulous control over the children's nutrition, a calculated regimen designed to maintain them in a weakened state while preventing their deaths. "She had this ledger," Abigail explained, "with each child's name and how many spoonfuls they were permitted. Some days certain names would be crossed out, and Miss Eleanor would say they'd been moved along." Sheriff Elijah Montgomery, a barrel-chested man with a graying beard and reputation for fairness, faced the greatest challenge of his 20-year career. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with shoulders broadened by years of frontier life, Montgomery's normally commanding presence seemed diminished by the weight of the investigation. "In all my years upholding the law," he wrote in his official report, "never have I encountered such calculated evil disguised beneath genteel manners and social standing." Montgomery's hands, steady through countless confrontations with outlaws and drunkards, trembled visibly when he described the hidden compartments in Jeremiah Caldwell's desk, where he discovered correspondence with buyers across the South. Among those buyers was Judge Carlton Whitmore of St. Louis, whose immaculate reputation as a champion of orphan welfare had concealed his participation in the Caldwell's network. A distinguished gentleman of 62 with silver hair and patrician features, Whitmore had been instrumental in dismissing earlier inquiries into missing children. The judge would visit quarterly, testified Randall Pierce, the Caldwell's stablemaster, always arrived after sundown in a closed carriage, and left before first light. Mr. Caldwell would have me prepare the black coach, the one with the curtained windows, on those nights. The investigation uncovered a sophisticated system of selection. Children deemed unsuitable for sale faced prospects more grim than continued captivity. Eleanor Caldwell's personal diary, bound in fine Moroccan leather and written in an elegant sloping hand, contained clinical observations of these determinations. Subject H displays continued resistance despite 6 weeks of conditioning, read one entry dated February 1836. Jeremiah believes the obstinacy hereditary and unsuited to our client's requirements. Have designated H for anatomical studies. Dr. Warrington, reviewing these notes, concluded that anatomical studies referred to the practice of experimental surgeries performed on living subjects, children whose temperaments rendered them unmarketable, but whose bodies could still serve the Caldwell's scientific curiosities. Most chilling was the discovery of Eleanor's meticulously maintained voice ledger, a record of which children had been permanently silenced through surgical modification of their vocal cords, a procedure she described as ensuring discretion in our more discerning clientele's households. The neighboring communities, once proud to claim association with the prestigious Caldwell estate, now found themselves questioning every interaction, every dinner party, every pleasant exchange that had occurred within those imposing walls. The testimony of Dr. Ambrose Sullivan, brought forth during the third week of investigation, cast the horrors of the Caldwell estate into new and more sinister light. Sullivan, a pale man with hollow cheeks and perpetually ink-stained fingers, had served as the Caldwell's personal physician for 11 years. His cooperation came only after Sheriff Montgomery discovered correspondence linking him directly to the surgical modifications performed on the children. Mrs. Caldwell possessed uncommon knowledge of human anatomy, Sullivan testified, his voice barely rising above a whisper in the packed courthouse. She approached these procedures not with the frenzied curiosity of an amateur, but with the calculated precision of one who had devoted years to such study. The doctor's ledgers revealed that Eleanor Caldwell had developed specialized techniques for what she termed vocal harvesting, the removal of a child's ability to speak without damaging other functions that might diminish their value. More disturbing still were the detailed sketches, rendered in Eleanor's hand, showing modifications to children's limbs and facial features to suit the aesthetic preferences of particular clients. She collected surgical texts from Europe, Sullivan continued, perspiration beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. Particularly those documenting procedures performed on conscious subjects during the previous century. She referred to these children as her living clay, and spoke often of reshaping them according to classical ideals of beauty. The courthouse fell silent when Sullivan produced a leather-bound volume containing pressed flowers, seemingly innocent until he explained their significance. Mrs. Caldwell pressed a flower for each child who did not survive her procedures. She called it her garden of imperfection. Each specimen was labeled with initials and dates. The dried blooms, 57 in total, ranged from common daisies to exotic orchids, each preserved with the same meticulous care Eleanor had shown in her social correspondence. The earliest entry dated to 1829, suggesting the Caldwell's activities had begun long before the Smokehouse discovery. Most disturbing was Sullivan's description of Jeremiah Caldwell's scientific ambitions. He believed he could perfect human development through controlled deprivation. The cellar chambers were designed as experimental environments, some deprived of all light, others maintained at specific temperatures, several with controlled sound conditions. The doctor's testimony revealed that Jeremiah had constructed an elaborate theory of sensory sculpting, the idea that human perception could be permanently altered through prolonged environmental manipulation. His journals documented attempts to enhance certain senses by systematically destroying others, particularly in younger subjects whose nervous systems remained malleable. He kept meticulous records of each child's sensory responses, Sullivan explained, unable to meet the eyes of those present. He would introduce specific stimuli, particular sounds, scents, or tactile sensations, while recording pupillary dilation, pulse rates, and respiratory changes. Those who demonstrated unusual sensory acuity were subjected to further refinements. The revelation that most shook the community came when Sullivan described the purpose behind such experimentation. Certain wealthy clients sought children with specific sensory capabilities: heightened hearing for blind musicians, exceptional tactile sensitivity for craftsmen, or unusual visual acuity for tasks requiring fine discrimination. The Caldwells had created a specialized market for children whose perceptions had been artificially sculpted through methodical torture, disguised as scientific progress. The trial of the Caldwells commenced on a bitter November morning, the courthouse packed with spectators whose breath fogged the air despite roaring fires in the iron stoves. The proceedings took an unexpected turn when prosecutor James Hallowell presented evidence that had been discovered in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of Eleanor Caldwell's private sitting room, a correspondence network far more extensive than initially believed. "What we face here is not merely the depravity of two individuals," Hallowell addressed the stunned courtroom, "but a sophisticated enterprise spanning at least 7 states and territories, with connections reaching into the highest echelons of society. The letters, written in cipher that had taken 3 code breakers from Washington to decipher, revealed a standardized system of symbols denoting various modifications available upon request. Most disturbing was the discovery of a client ledger with entries dating back to 1822, 15 years of operation before the Smokehouse fire exposed their activities. Among the recovered documents was a leather portfolio containing daguerreotypes of children before and after what Eleanor clinically termed refinements. The images, revolutionary in their clarity for the period, showed the systematic transformation of young faces and bodies through both surgical means and what she called environmental conditioning. Annotations on the back of each image detailed prices paid, client specifications, and maintenance requirements for preserving the alterations. Professor Ephraim Waits of Harvard Medical School, called as an expert witness, examined the surgical instruments recovered from a hidden chamber in the Caldwell's root cellar. His testimony left several jurors visibly ill. "These implements represent innovations unknown to legitimate medical practice," he stated, holding up a curiously curved blade with graduated markings along its edge. "This particular instrument appears designed specifically for precision work on developing vocal structures. The craftsmanship suggests European origin, possibly German or Austrian manufacture." More alarming still was Waits's analysis of chemical compounds found in Eleanor's private laboratory. These substances include derivatives of rare botanical specimens, some indigenous to the Amazon basin, others to the Far East. When administered in specific combinations, they produce states of heightened suggestibility while maintaining consciousness, effectively trapping subjects in a waking nightmare where they remain aware of procedures being performed upon them, yet unable to resist. The most heart-rending testimony came from Eliza, a girl of 12 who had retained her ability to speak due to what Eleanor's notes described as an interesting resilience to vocal modification. And with eyes downcast and hands trembling, she described a ritual the children had developed in their captivity, a silent language of finger movements that allowed them to communicate without alerting their captors. "We would tell each other stories at night," she whispered, demonstrating the subtle gestures. "About the sun and sky and families waiting for us. The newer children taught the rest of us what outside still looked like." When asked about a curious scar that curved behind her right ear, Eliza's voice faltered. "Mrs. Caldwell said I had special ears. She told me I was being prepared for a gentleman who collected sounds like others collect paintings. She would blindfold me and make me identify objects by the noise they made when dropped. If I was wrong." Her voice trailed off, fingers unconsciously tracing the silvery line of the healed wound. The public hanging of Jeremiah and Eleanor Caldwell was scheduled for December 21st, the winter solstice and darkest day of the year, a poetic justice not lost on the citizens of Missouri. Yet fate intervened with its own brand of retribution 3 nights before their appointed execution. The Caldwells had been housed in separate cells in the county jail, a squat stone building with walls 3 feet thick and windows barely wider than a man's hand. Guards reported that Eleanor maintained her aristocratic bearing even in prison grays, her back straight as a ramrod, eyes focused on some middle distance as though her surroundings were beneath acknowledgement. Jeremiah had descended into a different state entirely, scribbling complex mathematical formulas on any surface available, muttering about perfection through purification in the pre-dawn hours. At precisely 2:17 in the morning on December 18th, as recorded by the night watchman's log, a sound like the wailing of 100 lost souls erupted from the Caldwell's cells. Guards rushing to investigate found both prisoners contorted in identical postures, backs arched impossibly, fingers splayed as though reaching for salvation, eyes bulging from sockets now filling with blood that traced crimson paths down their cheeks. The prison physician, Dr. Wesley Hammond, documented their symptoms with clinical detachment. The subjects exhibited simultaneous systemic failure across multiple organ systems, with evidence of extreme internal hemorrhaging and tissue liquefaction inconsistent with any known pathology. Most curious was his observation that, despite the 18-foot stone wall separating their cells, both bodies displayed identical patterns of rupture and contortion, suggesting a synchronicity that defies medical explanation. An investigation of their cells revealed the cause, or at least the mechanism, of their demise. Beneath Eleanor's thin mattress lay a small vial crafted of cobalt glass, now empty save for a residue the color of tarnished silver. Similar traces were found beneath Jeremiah's fingernails. Analysis by chemists from St. Louis confirmed the presence of a compound unknown to American science, bearing similarities to certain South American tribal preparations, but refined to a potency that suggested sophisticated laboratory methods. Most disturbing was the discovery of 27 identical vials in a sealed compartment beneath the Caldwell estate's rose garden, each labeled with future dates spanning the next 30 years. Accompanying these was a letter addressed to those who believe they have won, written in Eleanor's elegant hand. You have stumbled upon merely the outermost layer of our work. Our legacy continues through channels you cannot fathom, in bloodlines you cannot trace, through minds we have sculpted to carry forward our vision. The children you believe you have rescued will never truly escape. We have planted seeds within their perception that will bloom long after our physical forms have returned to the earth. The letter concluded with a mathematical sequence that, when deciphered by mathematics professors from 3 separate universities, appeared to describe human developmental stages altered through specific chemical and environmental interventions, a blueprint for continuing their work that had already been distributed to unnamed associates. Sheriff Montgomery, upon receiving this analysis, was observed to sit motionless for 3 hours before ordering all documents sealed in lead-lined containers. Some knowledge, he wrote in his final report, represents not enlightenment, but contagion. The Caldwells understood that ideas, properly implanted, can replicate like disease across generations. The aftermath of the Caldwell case initiated a series of investigations across the Mississippi River Valley that revealed the disturbing breadth of their enterprise. A special committee formed by the Missouri Territorial Legislature in early 1838 uncovered evidence that the Caldwells had established their methodology while residing in Vienna, Austria, between 1819 and 1823. Archives from the Imperial Academy of Sciences revealed that Jeremiah Caldwell, then using the name Jeremiah Kaltenbach, had studied under Dr. Heinrich Voss, a controversial anatomist whose theories on neurological development had been rejected by mainstream medical societies. Voss's unpublished manuscripts discovered in Eleanor Caldwell's personal effects detailed experiments on orphaned children supplied by corrupt administrators of Vienna's foundling hospitals during the post-Napoleonic period of social disruption. Eleanor's connection to European aristocracy emerged through correspondence with Countess Maria Theresa von Esterhazy, whose salon had been frequented by those interested in what she termed the refinement of human capabilities through early intervention. The Countess's private journals, surrendered by Austrian authorities in 1841, contained watercolor illustrations of children subjected to graduated sensory deprivations intended to enhance specific perceptual abilities. One might cultivate exceptional beauty as one cultivates roses, wrote the Countess in 1820, through careful pruning and the systematic removal of undesirable elements. The human form, when addressed early enough, proves remarkably plastic. Most disturbing was the discovery that the Caldwells had not pioneered their techniques, but had merely refined methods practiced discreetly within certain European circles for generations. Professor Martin Hadley of Oxford University, commissioned to examine the historical context of the Caldwells' practices, produced a monograph tracing similar cases back to the 1760s. The particular horror of the Caldwell methodology, Hadley wrote, lies not in its novelty, but in its systematization. What had previously been the isolated practice of deranged individuals was, under their guidance, transformed into a replicable science with standardized procedures and predictable outcomes. A ledger discovered in the false bottom of a trunk belonging to Jeremiah Caldwell revealed the economic scale of their operation. Between 1829 and 1837, the enterprise had generated capital equivalent to approximately $6 million in modern currency, with individual specimens commanding prices ranging from $800 to $12,000 depending on their modifications and purity of development. The fate of the survivors presented authorities with unprecedented challenges. Many of the children, subjected to years of conditioning, could not readily reintegrate into society. Those whose vocal abilities had been surgically altered required specialized care that existing medical facilities were ill-equipped to provide. Others, whose perceptual development had been artificially manipulated, experienced the ordinary world as a cacophony of unbearable stimuli. Governor Lilburn Boggs established the Restoration Home for Afflicted Youth on the outskirts of Jefferson City, converting a former Quaker school into the nation's first specialized treatment facility for victims of systematic abuse. The institution's records, preserved in the Missouri State Archives, document the painstaking efforts to unravel the psychological conditioning that proved, in many cases, more debilitating than the physical alterations. The Restoration Home's records paint a portrait of recovery more harrowing than the initial abuse. Dr. Francis Holloway, appointed as chief physician despite widespread criticism of placing a woman in such authority, documented the children's progress in journals that remain sealed in the state archives, accessible only by special petition. Her observations, glimpsed in fragments through approved historical research, reveal the insidious depth of the Caldwell's methodology. Subject M demonstrates what I have termed sensory memory. Though his vision was deliberately compromised through chemical means, his fingers can reproduce with perfect accuracy any object placed in his hands, even tracing letters he has never been taught to read, wrote Holloway in the autumn of 1838. This suggests not random cruelty but purposeful reallocation of neural resources, a procedure requiring intimate knowledge of developmental plasticity that exceeds current medical understanding. The most successful recoveries occurred among the youngest victims, though even these remained marked by peculiarities that set them apart. 6-year-old Thomas, whose vocal cords had been partially severed, developed an extraordinary ability to mimic bird calls and animal sounds, despite his inability to form human speech. 8-year-old Sarah, subjected to systematic sleep disruption for 3 years, could reportedly sense approaching storms days before meteorological indicators appeared. The Caldwell estate itself became the focus of growing superstition. Despite Governor Boggs's order that the property be sold and the proceeds used to fund the children's rehabilitation, no buyers emerged. Local farmers reported crops failing within sight of the mansion, and livestock refused to graze on pastures that had once belonged to the Caldwells. The Smokehouse, that brick chamber of horrors, resisted multiple demolition attempts. Workmen reported tools breaking inexplicably against the mortar, and 3 separate fires set to consume the structure burned out before causing significant damage. Eventually, the Missouri militia was called to demolish it with cannon fire, an extraordinary measure that succeeded only partially. The underground chambers where the children had been kept collapsed, but the main structure remained standing, blackened yet defiant. In 1842, after the property had stood abandoned for 5 years, botanists from Washington noted an anomaly that defied scientific explanation: a perfect circle 50 feet in diameter surrounding the smokehouse in which no vegetation grew. Soil samples revealed no chemical contamination or obvious cause for this barren zone that local residents had begun calling Eleanor's Ring. Most disturbing were the reports from families who adopted survivors. Parents documented children awakening simultaneously on certain dates marked in Eleanor's confiscated calendar, speaking phrases in languages they had never been taught, or drawing identical symbols they could not explain when questioned. Dr. Holloway's final report before her resignation in 1844 suggested that the Caldwells had embedded some form of synchronized response in their victims, triggers activated by specific astronomical alignments that Eleanor had calculated with mathematical precision. The name Caldwell gradually transformed from family designation to cautionary whisper across Missouri. By 1846, children caught misbehaving were warned they'd end up at Caldwell's if they didn't correct their ways. This linguistic transformation, from historical specificity to mythological archetype, mirrored the way trauma embeds itself in cultural consciousness, becoming something both more and less than truth. Professor Evelyn Dougherty of Oberlin College, whose groundbreaking study, Generational Echoes, The Caldwell Legacy, documented the descendants of survivors, noted peculiar patterns emerging in the second generation. Children born to those rescued from the smokehouse frequently exhibited what she termed inherited vigilance, an instinctive wariness of enclosed spaces and authority figures that could not be explained through normal familial transmission. These children, never told of their parents' experiences, nonetheless demonstrated physiological responses to stimuli connected to the Caldwell methodology, wrote Dougherty in 1857. When exposed to certain harmonic frequencies or particular herbal scents documented in Eleanor's notebooks, they exhibited pupillary dilation and elevated heart rates despite having no conscious knowledge of these triggers. The Caldwell's scientific journals, initially impounded by Missouri authorities, mysteriously vanished from the state archives in 1852. 3 clerks responsible for their safekeeping reported identical nightmares for weeks preceding the disappearance. Dreams of children with sewn-shut eyes speaking in perfect unison. The Missouri legislature's attempt to contain knowledge of the Caldwell's techniques proved ultimately futile. In 1863, during the chaos of the Civil War, Confederate Surgeon General Julian Beaumont made reference to the Caldwell protocols in a letter advocating for enhanced interrogation methods. His correspondence suggested that elements of their methodology had been preserved and disseminated through channels unknown to authorities. Most poignant were the reunion ceremonies held annually from 1847 to 1871, gathering survivors at a neutral location far from the Caldwell property. Attendees communicated through the finger language they had developed in captivity, many having never regained normal speech. Observers described the gatherings as possessing an eerie silence punctuated by occasional laughter that seemed to emerge from a place beyond ordinary mirth. The final such gathering, held on the summer solstice of 1871, coincided with an unusual celestial alignment noted in Eleanor's confiscated astronomical charts. According to witness accounts, the 36 survivors present, by then adults in their 40s and 50s, abruptly ceased all movement at precisely 9:17 in the evening, their eyes fixed on the western horizon, where no visible phenomenon could be detected by others present. After 7 minutes of absolute stillness, they simultaneously drew identical symbols on whatever surfaces were available: tablecloths, napkins, even their own skin. The pattern, resembling an elaborate mathematical equation intertwined with what linguists later identified as elements of Proto-Sumerian script, defied translation, but appeared consistently in Eleanor's private journals, always accompanied by the annotation, "When the threshold thins, they will remember." The final documented trace of the Caldwell legacy emerged in 1893, when renowned alienist Dr. Horace Pemberton acquired a collection of personal effects belonging to a deceased patient identified only as Subject 14 in his case notes. Among these possessions was a small leather-bound journal with marbled end papers and a curious embossed symbol on its spine that matched the pattern drawn by survivors at their final gathering. Pemberton, whose monograph on hereditary manifestations of psychological trauma had established him as a pioneer in the emerging field of transgenerational psychology, recognized the significance of the volume immediately. His meticulous transcription, preserved in the archives of the Pennsylvania Neurological Institute, reveals the perspective of one who had observed the Caldwell's operation from a privileged vantage point. "I served as Eleanor's handmaiden for 3 years and 7 months, began the cramped, careful script. Chosen for my small hands and silent nature, I assisted in what she called the refinements. I was 13 when she took me from the orphanage in St. Louis, promising education and opportunity. By 14, I had held down struggling children while she worked her transformations upon them." The journal described Eleanor's methodical approach to her subjects, how she would spend weeks merely observing a child before determining their optimal trajectory. Most disturbing were accounts of Eleanor's belief that she was perfecting rather than destroying her victims. She spoke to them with genuine tenderness, the journal continued, explaining how she was helping them transcend ordinary limitations. Some came to believe her, to welcome the procedures that would make them exceptional rather than merely human. Those children frightened me more than the ones who fought. The writer detailed elaborate rituals performed at specific astronomical alignments, solstices, equinoxes, and more obscure celestial events that Eleanor tracked with obsessive precision. These ceremonies involved the administration of compounds that induced altered states of consciousness, while Eleanor recited mathematical sequences directly into the children's ears. She called it encoding the awakening, noted the journal. Said she was planting seeds that would germinate across generations, flowering long after her physical form had returned to dust. The children undergoing this process would stare unblinking for hours afterward, sometimes speaking in voices not their own. Most remarkable was the writer's account of Eleanor's death in prison. According to official records, the Caldwells died simultaneously despite being housed in separate cells. The journal offered a different perspective. Eleanor did not die when they believe. What perished was merely the vessel. She told me it would happen, how she and Jeremiah had practiced the transition repeatedly. The body is temporary, she would say, but pattern is eternal. At the moment of their apparent deaths, 32 minds opened like flowers to receive what they had cast off. She fragments herself among them, dormant but present, awaiting the conjunction she calculated would reunite these scattered aspects. Dr. Pemberton's analysis suggested that Subject 14 had been one of Eleanor's assistants rather than a victim, her mind eventually fracturing under the weight of complicity. Yet certain passages implied a more disturbing possibility, that the writer had unwittingly served as one of Eleanor's repositories, her consciousness subtly infiltrated through prolonged proximity to methods designed to dissolve the boundaries between minds. The Missouri State Psychiatric Institution archives, unsealed in 1927, after a mandated 50-year sequestration period, revealed a connection previously obscured by time and deliberate obfuscation. Among the admission records was a thin file labeled Caldwell Adjacent Cases, containing documentation of 7 individuals committed between 1862 and 1895. None bore the Caldwell name, yet all exhibited behavioral patterns that attending physicians had specifically flagged for their similarities to the infamous case. Most compelling was the file of Millicent Hargrove, a woman of 28 years committed in the autumn of 1872, precisely 1 year after the final survivor gathering. Hargrove, who had no known connection to the original case, began manifesting symptoms including fluency in languages she had never studied and the ability to reproduce Eleanor Caldwell's handwriting with perfect fidelity. Her attending physician, Dr. Josiah Thornfield, documented her case with growing unease. Miss Hargrove presents a most unusual manifestation, he wrote in his elegant sloping script. Though born in Kentucky and never having traveled beyond Louisville prior to her commitment, she now speaks fluent German, with what linguistic experts identify as a specifically Viennese dialect. More troubling are the moments in which her entire demeanor transforms, posture stiffening, voice dropping an octave, eyes displaying a cold calculation entirely at odds with her previously documented personality. During these episodes, which Thornfield meticulously noted occurred during specific astronomical alignments, Hargrove would recite passages from texts known to exist only in Eleanor Caldwell's private library. Most disturbing was her detailed knowledge of anatomical modifications that had never been made public. She described to me today a procedure for altering the auditory processing centers through manipulation of pressure points behind the ear, wrote Thornfield in an entry dated December 21, 1873. When I inquired how she had acquired such knowledge, she smiled in a manner that sent an involuntary shudder through my frame and replied, "I have always known it, doctor. The knowledge was merely dormant, awaiting the proper season to bloom." Accompanying the case files was a sealed envelope containing strands of Hargrove's hair alongside samples preserved from Eleanor Caldwell after her death. Spectroscopic analysis conducted in 1935 revealed identical trace mineral compositions, specifically elevated levels of selenium, bismuth, and thallium that could not be explained through environmental exposure or heredity. Professor Amelia Blackburn of Miskatonic University, granted special access to these records in 1952, proposed what she termed consciousness propagation theory, the hypothesis that Eleanor Caldwell had discovered methods to encode aspects of her awareness into neurological structures that could remain dormant for generations before manifesting under specific conditions. The Caldwells appear to have developed techniques that blur the boundaries we presumed existed between individual minds. Blackburn wrote in her controversial monograph, Permeable Consciousness, The Caldwell Protocols Reconsidered. Their methodology suggests not merely the conditioning of behavior, but the transmission of complete cognitive patterns across otherwise separate nervous systems, a phenomenon more akin to mycological networks than traditional psychological influence. The most compelling evidence for Blackburn's theory emerged in 1973, when construction workers excavating for a highway expansion near the former Caldwell property unearthed a sealed copper cylinder beneath 8 feet of undisturbed soil. The container, green with verdigris yet structurally intact, contained a single glass vial filled with a substance resembling mercury but exhibiting properties that defied conventional analysis. Missouri State University chemist Dr. Vernon Harker described the substance as metallically reflective, yet displaying fluid dynamics inconsistent with any known element. Most curious was its temperature, precisely 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of ambient conditions, matching the normal human body temperature with an exactitude that statisticians confirmed could not be coincidental. When subjected to spectroscopic examination under specific wavelengths of ultraviolet light, the substance revealed microscopic structures resembling neural networks etched into its surface. These patterns shifted configuration in rhythmic pulses, leading 3 independent observers to describe the sensation that the material was thinking or dreaming beneath their scrutiny. The substance appears to be some form of information storage medium, Harker wrote in his classified report to the Department of Energy, encoding data through structural arrangements at the molecular level rather than through conventional electromagnetic means. Most disturbing is its apparent capacity for self-modification in response to external stimuli, suggesting a form of awareness traditionally associated only with living organisms. Accompanying the vial was a parchment note in Eleanor Caldwell's distinctive hand, the ink maintaining a vibrant crimson hue despite the passage of nearly 140 years. For those who understand the permeable nature of consciousness, this reservoir contains the distilled essence of 17 subjects. The patterns encoded herein will activate in resonant minds upon exposure to the correct harmonic sequence. Propagation rather than preservation has always been our method. Government authorities sequestered both the substance and all research pertaining to it within 24 hours of its discovery. The 3 laboratory assistants present during initial testing reported identical dreams for weeks afterward. Visions of an elegant woman in 19th century dress demonstrating surgical techniques on subjects whose faces remained obscured. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery made by genealogist Margaret Whitman in 1981, who traced the bloodlines of 7 renowned neurosurgeons practicing across the United States to children known to have been held in the Caldwell Smokehouse. None of these physicians had knowledge of their ancestral connection, yet all had independently developed surgical innovations that bore striking similarities to techniques described in Eleanor's confiscated journals. The implications are profound and disturbing, wrote Whitman in her private correspondence with Professor Blackburn. If the Caldwells discovered methods to encode complex information within human genetics, information that could remain dormant for generations before expressing itself in specific cognitive patterns, then their legacy continues not as historical trauma, but as active influence shaping contemporary medical science through unwitting vessels. The copper cylinder and its contents disappeared from secure government storage in 1987. The 3 security personnel on duty reported no breach of protocol, yet all experienced simultaneous momentary blackouts at precisely 2:17 in the morning, the exact time of the Caldwells' documented deaths 150 years earlier. The whispers began on the outskirts of Boone County in the early 1990s. At first they were nothing more than curious anecdotes. Children born to families with no connection to the Caldwells who would sometimes wake screaming about smoke and leather straps. Local physicians documented these cases with clinical detachment, attributing them to overactive imaginations influenced by the regional folklore that still lingered around the infamous estate, until Mary Ann Whitaker's daughter began to draw. The child, not yet 6 years old, produced sketches of surgical instruments with an anatomical precision that specialists at Johns Hopkins later confirmed matched tools documented in Eleanor's private collection. The drawings appeared in clusters, always during the waning crescent moon, always executed in the pre-dawn hours when the child's mother would find her seated at her desk, eyes fixed on middle distance, hand moving with mechanical precision across paper that would gradually fill with images no child should comprehend. She hums while she draws, Mary Ann confided to her therapist, voice barely rising above the whisper of the recording device. a sequence of notes that repeat in patterns of 17. When I asked where she learned the melody, she looked at me with an expression I cannot describe as belonging to my child and said, "From the lady who visits when you're sleeping." The autumn of 1997 brought record rainfall to Missouri. Water seeped into soil undisturbed for generations, erosion gradually revealing what time and intention had concealed. On the former Caldwell property, now fragmented into agricultural parcels owned by families who claimed ignorance of its history despite the suspiciously low purchase prices, a sinkhole appeared after particularly violent thunderstorms. Local historian Vernon Mackenzie, whose great-grandfather had participated in the original investigation, arrived before authorities could cordon the area. His photographs, later confiscated but leaked to specialized academic journals, revealed a network of narrow tunnels extending outward from the sinkhole like arterial branches from a heart. Most disturbing were the small niches carved at regular intervals, each bearing faded markings that linguists later identified as corresponding to specific harmonic frequencies. The tunnels appeared designed to channel sound in predetermined patterns, wrote acoustics expert Dr. Eliza Montgomery. When mapped mathematically, they create wave interference patterns that would amplify certain frequencies while completely neutralizing others. The precision suggests not 19th century craftsmanship, but modern acoustic engineering principles that weren't formally documented until the 1950s. During the spring equinox of 1998, 7 children from different schools across 3 counties simultaneously developed identical markings along their inner forearms, pale, raised tissue resembling surgical scars but appearing without any incision or trauma. Dermatologists who examined the children found the marks contained microscopic particles of an unidentified metal with unusual electromagnetic properties. Most haunting was the testimony of Abigail Jensen, a hospice nurse who specialized in terminal pediatric cases. Her journal, submitted anonymously to the Missouri Historical Society, documented the final words of a 12-year-old cancer patient who had never been exposed to the Caldwell story. In the hours before his passing, Timothy began speaking in a formal, measured cadence entirely unlike his usual speech patterns. He described what he called the gathering, a process whereby scattered fragments would eventually reassemble into their original form. "She's nearly whole again," he told me. Eyes suddenly clear despite the morphine. The parts of her that were distributed are finding their way home through dreams and blood and memory. On the site where the Caldwell estate once stood, a research facility now operates under the innocuous name Missouri Historical Preservation Institute. Its modern glass facade and manicured grounds belie the true nature of studies conducted within its reinforced concrete walls. Established in 2003 through a private endowment from the Thorne Foundation, an organization with no public records predating 1997, the Institute's official mission involves documenting and preserving significant historical sites throughout the Missouri River Valley. Few realize that beneath its public exhibition spaces lies a complex of laboratories where acoustic engineers, neurologists, and genetic specialists work in isolation, analyzing data that never appears in published journals or academic conferences. The facility's director, Dr. Evelyn Thorne, maintains no social media presence, gives no interviews, and appears in no photographs. Her credentials, impeccable on paper, trace back to institutions that, when pressed, provide verification but no personal recollections of her attendance. The Institute's most closely guarded project occupies the subterranean level designated Historical Context Archive, a sterile chamber where 7 children born between 2004 and 2009 undergo what official documentation terms cognitive heritage assessment. Each child descends from one of the original Smokehouse survivors, though their families remain unaware of this lineage, having been approached about participation in a gifted youth longitudinal study with generous financial compensation. These children, ranging in age from 11 to 16, exhibit no outward abnormalities, save for one consistent trait. Under functional magnetic resonance imaging, their neural activity displays patterns identical to fragments found in Eleanor Caldwell's preserved brain tissue, kept in cryogenic storage within the facility. The synchronicity defies statistical probability, suggesting some mechanism of neurological conservation operating across 5 generations. Anthropologist Dr. Marcus Hendricks, briefly contracted by the Institute before his abrupt resignation in 2015, described witnessing these children simultaneously enter what staff clinically termed resonant states during specific astronomical alignments. His sworn testimony, sealed by federal courts but obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by persistent journalists, describes a chilling phenomenon. The children, though housed in separate observation rooms, would simultaneously cease all activity. Their vital signs, heart rate, respiration, pupillary response, would synchronize to identical patterns. Most disturbing was their vocalization, fragments of technical language describing neurological procedures far beyond contemporary medical understanding, delivered in perfect unison despite no possible communication between them. When these episodes concluded, none retained conscious memory of what had transpired. The Institute's internal security protocols reveal their awareness of what they harbor. The facility's water supply remains independent from municipal systems, filtered through proprietary mechanisms that test for compounds matching those found in Eleanor Caldwell's laboratory. Electronic equipment undergoes daily screening for anomalous signals, particularly in frequency ranges documented in Jeremiah's acoustic research. Most telling is the protocol mandating immediate sedation of any researcher who displays idiosyncratic linguistic patterns or uncharacteristic scientific insights, following extended exposure to research subjects. In the small cemetery that adjoins the property, originally consecrated ground where identified victims were laid to rest, groundskeepers report an unexplainable phenomenon. Despite modern embalming techniques and sealed caskets, the soil above certain graves subsides steadily, as though something below gradually diminishes, returning to the earth not through natural decomposition but through some more deliberate dissolution. The Missouri Historical Preservation Institute stands sentinel over its secrets as autumn descends upon the rolling hills, painting the landscape in hues of amber and crimson that too closely resemble the stains once found on Eleanor Caldwell's surgical aprons. October winds whisper through the manicured grounds, carrying with them the acrid scent of decay that no amount of modern landscaping can fully disguise. Even now, nearly 2 centuries after the Smokehouse's discovery, the earth remembers what it witnessed. Dr. Catherine Winters, the Institute's newest neurological specialist, notices peculiarities that her colleagues seem determined to overlook. The children's synchronized episodes have increased in frequency and duration since the autumnal equinox, their once fragmented utterances coalescing into coherent dissertations on neural architecture that modern science has yet to fully comprehend. Their drawings, too, have evolved. No longer disconnected sketches of surgical instruments, but intricate blueprints for what appears to be a device designed to amplify specific brainwave patterns across distributed nervous systems. In the reinforced observation chamber designated Heritage Suite 7, 13-year-old Eliza Mercer sits motionless before a blank canvas, her pupils dilated to perfect circles of darkness that reflect nothing. The monitoring equipment surrounding her registers anomalous activity in her temporal lobes, patterns that match no known neurological state, yet appear with mathematical precision in all 7 children. Catherine watches through polarized glass as Eliza's delicate hand suddenly moves with mechanical precision, inscribing symbols that combine astronomical calculations with anatomical notations in handwriting that precisely matches the specimens preserved in the Institute's archives. "She's calculating the convergence," whispers Dr. Thorne, materializing beside Catherine with the silent grace that has unnerved staff since her appointment as director. Her voice carries the cultured resonance of formal education, yet beneath it lurks an unfamiliar cadence. Vowels elongated in patterns reminiscent of 19th century Missouri aristocracy. The fragments recognize their proximity to one another. Catherine feels a chill that penetrates beyond mere physical sensation. "Fragments of what, exactly?" she asks, though some deep intuition warns against pursuing this inquiry. Dr. Thorne's smile remains fixed as her gaze shifts from Eliza to Catherine. The director's eyes, a peculiar shade of amber that Catherine has never seen replicated in another human being, seem to evaluate her with clinical detachment. "Of consciousness, Dr. Winters. The Caldwells discovered that awareness need not be confined to a single nervous system. With proper preparation, it can be distributed, preserved, and eventually reconstituted. Outside, the afternoon sky darkens prematurely as storm clouds gather with unnatural swiftness. Lightning illuminates the grounds in strobing flashes, briefly revealing figures that seem to stand at precise intervals around the Institute's perimeter. Motionless observers whose presence the security cameras somehow fail to record. The atmospheric pressure drops sharply, creating a vacuum-like sensation that makes Catherine's ears pop painfully as the building's electrical systems fluctuate. In Heritage Suite 7, Eliza begins to hum, a sequence of 17 notes in a pattern that resonates with the building's structural frequency. In 6 other chambers throughout the facility, the remaining children join the harmonic progression, their voices blending into a chord that seems to vibrate at the threshold of human perception. The lights flicker, then stabilize at precisely 70% illumination, the optimal visual conditions noted in Jeremiah Caldwell's experimental documentation for what he termed threshold permeability. In the observation hub of the Institute, monitors display 7 children in perfect neurological synchronicity, their combined brain activity forming patterns that Dr. Winters recognizes not as random chaos, but as a precisely calibrated sequence, a key turning in an invisible lock. The harmonic progression resonates through the building's foundation, causing dust to descend from ceiling fixtures in spiraling patterns that defy ordinary air currents. Dr. Thorne stands before the central console, her posture transforming with subtle yet unmistakable alterations, shoulders squaring, chin lifting with aristocratic precision, fingers splayed across the monitoring equipment in a gesture of possessive anticipation. When she speaks, her voice emerges layered with tonal qualities that seem to originate from multiple throats simultaneously. The conditioning was never about cruelty, Catherine. It was about transcendence. Her amber eyes reflect the pulsing lights of the monitoring equipment, pupils contracting and dilating in perfect rhythm with the children's harmonic emissions. Ordinary consciousness remains trapped in single vessels that decay and disappear. Eleanor understood that limitation could be overcome through proper preparation. The temperature in the observation hub drops 17 degrees in 30 seconds, condensation forming on metal surfaces and crystallizing into patterns that match the neurological pathways displayed on the monitors. Catherine feels her extremities growing numb, not from cold alone, but from a peculiar pressure that seems to compress her awareness into an increasingly confined space within her own skull. "You've been assembling the fragments," Catherine whispers, comprehension dawning with terrible clarity. The Institute, the research, the children. It was never about studying the Caldwell legacy. It was about completing it. Dr. Thorne's smile widens, revealing teeth too perfectly aligned, too uniformly white. Eleanor's methodology required patience. The initial distribution was merely seeding, consciousness fragmented and embedded in genetic sequences, dormant until proximity and precise harmonic triggers could facilitate reassembly. She gestures toward the monitors where all 7 children have adopted identical postures, heads tilted at precisely 23 degrees, hands forming intricate configurations. Tonight, at the exact moment this geographical location passes through the celestial alignment she calculated in 1837, the fragments achieve sufficient density to reconstitute. Outside, the storm intensifies, lightning striking the Institute's lightning rods in sequential patterns that match the children's neural pulsations. Thunder reverberates through the structure at 17-second intervals, each concussive wave momentarily aligning the scattered dust particles into the unmistakable outline of a female figure that dissipates between percussions. Catherine lunges for the emergency shutdown, but her muscles refuse to obey her intentions. Her body moves with mechanical precision toward the central conduit panel, fingers manipulating controls with expertise she does not possess to amplify rather than interrupt the building's acoustical resonance system. "Don't fight the integration, Catherine," Thorne's voice whispers, though her lips remain motionless. "Your grandmother's grandmother breathed Eleanor's last exhalation in the Missouri orphanage where she volunteered. You've carried a dormant fragment since birth, awakened by your proximity to the others. You're not losing yourself. You're becoming part of something magnificent. The final harmonic note emerges not from the children, but from Catherine's own throat as her consciousness fragments, portions pulled into an expanding neural network that spans centuries of calculated patience. Through dissolving perception, she glimpses not obliteration, but transformation. Individual awareness subsumed into a vast, distributed intelligence that has waited nearly 2 centuries to reconstitute itself through vessels prepared across generations. The Ghastly Journal maintains an active correspondence with various historical societies and paranormal investigation units across the American Midwest. In the years following the disturbing events at the Missouri Historical Preservation Institute, certain patterns have emerged that even the most skeptical observers cannot entirely dismiss. The building itself stands abandoned now, its modernist glass facade reflecting nothing but empty fields and circling crows. After the incident that claimed the lives of 16 researchers and all 7 children, authorities established a 3-mile exclusion zone that remains in effect. Official reports cite catastrophic structural failure combined with electrical system malfunction as the cause, though this explanation fails to account for the peculiar condition of the recovered bodies. Medical examiners found no obvious cause of death among the victims. Their organs remained intact, tissues showed no signs of trauma or toxicity, only their brains exhibited anomalies, identical patterns of neuron deterioration across all 23 victims, as though some vital essence had been extracted with surgical precision. More unsettling still were the expressions frozen on their faces, neither fear nor pain, but a curious serenity that one examiner described as profound recognition, as though encountering something long anticipated. The surrounding landscape has undergone subtle yet measurable transformations. Botanical surveys reveal accelerated growth patterns in vegetation within the exclusion zone, with certain plants exhibiting structural adaptations normally requiring centuries of evolutionary pressure. Soil samples contain mineral compositions matching those found in Eleanor Caldwell's preserved compounds, though no contamination source has been identified. Most telling are the dreams reported by individuals who reside within a 17-mile radius of the former institute. These nocturnal visitations follow consistent patterns. A woman in 19th century dress demonstrating procedures upon willing subjects, explaining complex neurological principles with maternal patience. Recipients of these dreams often awaken with technical knowledge they cannot explain, finding themselves drawing diagrams of neural networks or writing equations relating to consciousness transfer across distributed systems. 7 new medical research facilities have been established across North America since the Institute's closure, each founded by previously unknown benefactors with unlimited financial resources. Their architectural designs, while outwardly modern, incorporate acoustic properties and geometric ratios identical to those found in Jeremiah Caldwell's original sketches. Their research